verses 1 through 4 and verses 12 through 16. And then after our song, we look forward to Pastor Hendricks leading us with his message, Parenting the Church. Psalm 78. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their children. We will tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, and the wonders that he has done. In the sight of their ancestors, he worked marvels in the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zon. He divided the seas and let them pass through it, and made the waters stand like a heap. In the daytime, he led them with a cloud, and all night long with a fiery light. He split rocks open in the wilderness, and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock, and caused waters to flow down like rivers.
Good morning. I told Ann and Mary Ann before the service I was scheduled to speak the Sunday that the pandemic started. So I didn't get to preach that Sunday. And at that time I was looking forward to preaching because I hadn't preached for several months before that. And so I was thinking about this last night. It's been over a year since I've preached. So I feel a little bit sorry for you this morning because I've got all this stuff pent up inside, and you might get a little more than you paid for this morning. But it is good to be here with you. The late comedian Phyllis Diller frequently remarked that most children threaten at times to run away from home. And then she added, "This is the only thing that keeps some parents going." Today, in the Church of the Brethren, several dozen congregations in the Southeast District, and perhaps others in other districts around our nation, are taking steps to leave our denomination. So it occurred to me when I read today's scripture lesson that I'd like to talk about parenting, but I think I got part of my mask in my mouth there, I'm sorry. Not so much parenting children, but parenting the church. How do we as members of our denomination parent the church today as it is? As Phyllis Diller comments, some of our children are threatening to leave home. In fact, they are planning their first annual meeting next month. So we might say they've already run away. Perhaps, for some, this seems like good news. The church has been badly divided now for 50 years. Maybe this should be viewed as a good thing. But for many of us, it feels like a sad time, and certainly a time that calls for some reflection for those of us who remain. Now, they say parenting is not for the faint of heart. Yes, a newborn child is a bundle of joy, but very soon, she's a handful of aggravation. Parents are often surprised to observe that, especially as the first child grows, that children quickly develop a mind of their own and a will of their own. And when this happens, what are parents supposed to do? They don't come with a rule book attached to them. We kind of learn on the fly. We depend a lot on grandparents to give us advice. We ask other parents what they find to be successful in their experience. In the early 18th century, when the Brethren movement began, leaders of the church simply put people in jail for associating with radical pietists. That's who the brethren were. The brethren were radical pietists, part of the German Palatinate, as it was called. Some of the early brethren spent some time in jail simply because their pastor, where they were supposed to go to church, where they were supposed to baptize their children, would report their activities to the local authorities. And then the local authorities would, say for instance, come and put the husband in jail and then put pressure on the wife to have the children baptized. So this really doesn't seem like an option for us today, does it? We will probably need to search for other answers besides that of putting the leaders of these runaway churches in jail. We won't be doing that. One place we could go to for answers is where a lot of parents go to for answers, and to be honest, all of us, I would suspect, go there occasionally, is Google. If you type in parenting on Google, you would find that there probably are some good books on parenting there. And that's exactly what some parents do. Or another idea would be to adopt the philosophy or strategy of former President Harry S. Truman, to which he said, I have found the best way to give advice to your children is to find out what they want and then advise them to do it. Well, if we apply that to our situation, maybe encouraging those that are wanting to leave is the best advice. Chances are pretty good that's what they're going to do anyway. Some will say, well, let them leave, and advise them to go ahead and leave. After 50 years of conflict in the church, maybe leaving is the right thing to do. Parents should be encouraged by the news that the discipline of children is not a new concern. It's been a topic of countless conversations in kitchens, bathrooms, bedrooms, classrooms, churches, probably around ancient campfires before the wheel was invented. People talked about how to discipline children. I would imagine you folks here at Creekside have had some conversations about these things over the years yourselves. And not just raising your own children, but also about the problems that we are experiencing in our denomination. When we look at the Bible, clearly Adam and Eve had issues with their boys, Cain and Abel. And it didn't get better. The 12 Israel boys were a contentious lot. You'll remember they conspired to get rid of one of their youngest brothers. Even the old priest Eli had evil children, and his protege Samuel didn't fare much better as a parent either. So there's not a lot of that we can learn from there except to say that other people have had problems like we've had. We have perhaps the most famous dictum about parenting of all: spare the rod, spoil the child. A text which alone has justified the beatings of more children than one can possibly imagine. Fortunately, this phrase doesn't appear in the Bible. It comes from the pen of the 17th century writer Samuel Butler in his poem Hudibras. But there are many parents who believe that this expression comes from the Bible and find that its sentiment may be expressed in Proverbs, where in chapter 13, verse 24, we read, "Whoever spoils the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them." But it's unfortunate that parents thought that that was a rod that should be used to discipline their children, because that's not at all what the rod is for. The rod that's referred to in this passage is the rod of a shepherd. For instance, we all know what it says in Psalm 23, what a rod is used for, right? It says, "Thy rod and thy staff," what do? They comfort me. So the shepherd would take the curved end of his rod and kind of guide his sheep and pull them out of harm if they were getting themselves into trouble. It was meant to be an instrument of comfort. I can assure you, my dad would have been pretty upset with me if he ever saw me hitting an animal, whether it was a sheep or a pig or a cow. That wasn't the way we treated our animals. Usually, you try to give guidance to children. You try to keep things moving in a positive direction. In our current situation, I think that's the one thing we could give thanks to for our denominational leaders, is that they have met with the leaders of the CBC. The CBC stands for Covenant Brethren Church, if you haven't heard this term. But the CBC, on several occasions, have held meetings, and our denominational leaders have met with them, offered counsel, have tried to give them direction. But alas, this has not worked out well. Parents in the history of child discipline have often used sticks, branches, rulers, baseball bats even, belts, and straps to beat their children into submission. The romantic memory of taking them out to the old woodshed is something that certainly my parents talked about a lot. But it was fortunate for me, I had two older brothers, and they were the ones who got to experience that, not me so much. I was just too cute for that. But it used to be parents would send a child who was having a meltdown and tell him to go sit in the corner, to stand there, have his head pressed into the intersection of two walls where he was supposed to contemplate his world and the wicked path he was on. And hopefully he will return and be better for it. That was the hope. Certainly, it gave parents a chance to cool down, think about the situation themselves, and hope that maybe the children would behave better in the future. I don't know if this happens much anymore. Today's parents put children in timeout. So the child does have an opportunity to calm down, but as I observed last weekend with my granddaughter, when my daughter-in-law put her in timeout, she seemed to get louder rather than quieter. And I observed the expression on my daughter-in-law's face. She seemed to not to be simmering down herself as a result of our 3-year-old granddaughter's emoting, I'll call it. Well, denominational leaders in the past have suggested some timeouts. We've had some periods in the life of our denomination where we couldn't talk about some things for a period of time, thinking that that would help us to take some time out and perhaps lower the temperature for a while. Maybe that would help our conflict. Now, many parents don't believe time out is an appropriate response to bad behavior. In fact, some don't believe in punishing children at all. One writer suggests that all punishments are basically ineffective. Now, this is an interesting philosophy. The vast majority of kids don't misbehave, they say. They behave. Children behave like kids. And to some degree, I can understand that and even agree with it. Oftentimes, I can remember that my decision to discipline my children in ways that I now reflect on often had more to do with how I was feeling at the time than with their behavior. The same behavior might happen one day, but there's nobody around to observe it except me, and I do nothing. But the next time it happens in front of their grandparents, I think, oh, I better punish them now because the grandparents are going to think, well, why aren't you doing something about that? See, I believe it's clear, though, that God does not share the same opinion that these people who have this philosophy have. At least it would appear so from our text today. We only have read only 8 verses of chapter 72, or 78 rather, but there are 72 verses. So in your private time this week, you might want to read the whole psalm to get a better feeling of the context of the passage today. To understand its intent, I think a fuller reading is necessary. And I'm going to share some other verses from the psalm this morning to give you a feel for that. But this week, certainly, if you have time to read the whole psalm, it is the second longest psalm in the Psalms, and so it's kind of an interesting psalm for that reason. To understand its intent, I think that's necessary. God's having none of this business of letting kids be kids. If you read this psalm, it seems clear that God understands that behaving like children, in this case, has to do with being bad children. There's a recent posting on Newsline from our denominational leaders, which actually started me thinking about this sermon, frankly. And that posting there reminds us that in times like this, we as members of the church are encouraged not to act like bad children, that we're not to engage in unethical behavior. In other words, they're worried that others will want to leave like these that have already have left. They're also worried that some of the leaders of those churches will come and try to convince other churches that they should leave. And that would be unethical. In fact, it's unethical for them to leave, but that's another story. It's the covenant, the choice of Covenant Brethren Church is an interesting name for a new denomination because they're making a new covenant. But in order to make a new covenant, what did you have to do? You had to break the old covenant, right? As pastors, we all made promises to be in keeping with the Church of the Brethren. So when you break away, that's unethical behavior. But they do that, I think they think, for good reasons. So, this psalm, Psalm 78, gives us a brief history of the relationship between our divine parent and his bad children. And he makes three major assertions. So let me share those with you and then we'll be done. The first assertion is this: God treated the Israelites with love and with kindness and showered upon them incredible blessings. And to back up this assertion, let me share what the psalm says. In verse 12, in the sight of their ancestors, he worked marvels in the land of Egypt and in the fields of Zon. In verse 13, it says, God divided the sea and let them pass through it and made the waters like a heap. In verse 14, it says, in the daytime, God led them with a cloud, and at night, led them with a fiery light. In verse 15, God split rocks open in the wilderness and gave them drink that they might have water in the desert. In verse 16, God made streams come out of the rock and caused the waters to flow down like rivers. In verses 23 through 25, it says that God commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven, rained down manna on them to eat, gave them the grain of heaven. Mortals ate the bread of angels, and he sent this food to them in abundance, so they were never hungry in their wandering. Verses 26 through 28, God caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he let out the south wind, and he rained flesh upon them like dust, winged birds like sand of the seas. God let them fall within their camp, all around their dwellings. The people of Israel had all these blessings to which they organized their life around these. They celebrated these events every year. In verse 29, it says, they ate and were filled. God gave them what they craved. So the psalmist is suggesting that the people have forgotten all that God has done for them. And that as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been rather diligent and devoted, no one could seriously argue that God had failed them in any way, or neglected them, or rejected them. Instead, God had been their God, and they had been God's people. So, the first assertion of the psalm is that it's a good thing to be reminded of the goodness of God. If God were to lay out before us a list of the blessings and actions and compassion and kindness with which God has treated us, what would be on that list? And you shared several this morning. You know, just being able. We didn't know how much we missed just hearing each other sing until we don't do it anymore, or just coming here to be together. When you can't do that, that's all you want to do, right? I mean, you can't wait till you are doing it. So we don't sit here in silence not knowing what to say when we think about the many blessings. We know that we are very blessed, that God's been good to us. When you think about our history, the early brethren came here hoping to build their homes in a new country, to worship freely, to practice their faith without fear of being put in jail. From a small group of only maybe approximately 100 or 200 people, nearly all of the early brethren boarded ships and left their homes. Some cases they left their families behind and also left their fortunes behind to come and live in Penn's Woods in this new English colony known as Pennsylvania. This small group of brethren grew in time to over 200,000 members. But in the past 50 years, because of this conflict in our church, we have shrunk now to roughly around 100,000. But people say that it's even fewer than that worship together on Sunday mornings. So we have really experienced a lot of pain from this conflict that we've experienced. Today in Nigeria, there are more brethren than there are here in the United States. That's something to celebrate, something to be thankful for, but it gives us, Ann and I, a lot of joy. We have a young man in our church from Nigeria that's been studying at Notre Dame. And it's so much fun to ask him questions about how things are done in their church and how they're experiencing life in their church compared to ours. There are at least 7 different denominations. If the CBC continues in their direction, there will be 8 different denominations now that have roots back to those first 8 brethren who were baptized in Schwarzenau in 1708. But just putting that aside, just looking at yourselves here at Creekside, you know God has blessed this congregation. You have a beautiful place to worship. You have beautiful grounds. You have opportunities for service in this community. I'm always impressed with the results of your gardening efforts. God has been good to you. So this assertion that the psalmist makes, I think is not only is it true, but it's one that is good for us to be reminded of, that it's a good thing to be reminded of the goodness of God. Maybe even more so in a time of pandemic, to be reminded of God's goodness. The second assertion the psalmist makes is that the Israelites not only took these blessings for granted, but their wicked behavior insulted the one who provided them. And the psalmist prepares an itemized list of misdemeanors, wrongful acts by which the Israelites pretty much thumbed their noses at God. And let me just share some of them. You might say they acted like teenagers who complain that there's nothing to do, even though they like to stay out all night. In verse 32, it says, "In spite of all this, they still sinned and did not believe in the wonders of God." Verse 17, it says, "They sinned more against God, rebelling against the Most High in the desert." In verse 18, they tested God. Did your children ever test you? Some could say that we've been tested the past 50 years as members of this church as we tried to figure out how to deal with the conflict in our denomination. Verse 19, it says, they spoke against God, saying, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness?" Verse 36, they flattered God with their mouths, but they lied with their tongues. Verse 37, their heart was not steadfast towards God. They were not true to the covenant. Verse 40, how often they rebelled against God in the wilderness, and how often they grieved him in the desert. In verse 41, they tested God again and again and provoked the Holy One of Israel. And in verses 42 and 43, they didn't keep in mind God's power or the day when God redeemed them from the foe, or when God displayed signs in Egypt or miracles in the fields of Zon. And finally, verses 56 and 57, they tested the most holy God, rebelled against God. They didn't observe decrees but turned away and were faithless like their ancestors. They twisted like a treacherous bow. Okay, so it's a good thing to be reminded of our tendencies to test God's patience, our inclination to rebel and to wander far from God's love and care. Throughout this pandemic, I've been reading about the early brethren, and it's interesting to me how in their time they thought the end of the world was near. And so everything was especially important to them. And I think maybe during a time of pandemic, it's easy for us to feel like, are these the end times? You know, certainly for now, over 200,000 people has been the end times for them. When children behave badly, we understand that they do this because they're children, right? Children can be excused for behaving badly because they don't know that it's bad to behave badly. Their world is quite narrow. For a child, they believe they're the center of the world, therefore everything revolves around them and everything should be just the way they want it, whether that's right or not. My granddaughter, Rosanna's granddaughter, wants a M&M every time she wants an M&M. But it would be bad for us as grandparents to always give her an M&M every time, especially if the parents are looking. Children do not always understand that parents, being parents, often act in ways that children don't understand. And they will never understand that because they're children. And they lack the cognitive and the reasoning skills necessary for mature, reasonable discussion. Sometimes no just has to be the answer. The comedian Jim Gaffigan gives us an example of this. He says, toddler judgment is horrible. They don't have any. Put a 12-month on a bed and they will immediately try and crawl off head first like a lemming on a mindless migration mission. But the toddler's mission is never mindless. They have two goals: find poison and find something to destroy. Now he says this in reference to a song by Cat Stevens. The song goes, "Morning has broken." And then he goes on and he says, "I'm pretty sure my children broke it." Like everything else they break, if they did break it, they'd never admit it. Well, this seems to be the case with the Israelites. It's a mark of our maturity as Christians if we understand that God is God and that we are not. That God demonstrates love for us in many different ways. Now, immature Christians would display any of the behaviors in the list that I just read. In our church today, if you listen to progressives, they can tell you all about conservatives and list you a whole list of bad behaviors of the conservatives in our church. If you listen to conservatives in our church talking about progressives, they can do the same thing. You will hear a list of bad behaviors on all sides. And if you feel like you're in the middle between these groups, and you've been listening to this for 50 years, then you know what I'm talking about. Because all sides in this conflict have exhibited bad behavior. And maybe you could say, have been bad children. I mean all sides, because oftentimes when you're in the middle, it's a very passive role. We don't take a very active, we don't see ourselves as actively involved in a conflict because we're not, but in some ways we enable the conflict by being so passive. So all sides have, I think, reason to be humble about what is happening in our church. The third assertion that the psalmist makes is that God then sent numerous punishments to help shock the errant children into compliance and an appreciation of their former good fortune. God decides to let them have it. And not just once, but again and again. In fact, the recital of God's wrath against these children reads like a rap sheet. It's not pretty at all. We'd like to say those were different days. Those were what we call apocalyptic times, end times. And some will say we live in apocalyptic times today. If you try, and you don't have to try very hard, there are preachers talking about these as the end times, apocalyptic times. In fact, I would dare say probably those who are leaving the church feel like in times like this, you have to take a stand. And so they're pushing their memberships to take a stand and to move in a direction that they perhaps thought they would never go. People point to global pandemic, to global crisis, climate crisis, to riots over inequality and injustice, and say, these are the end times. So today we may punish children for bad behavior, although as noted above, some parenting experts don't believe in punishing children. Most parents see the value of reasonable punishment, especially if it's a means to correcting bad behavior. So, good parents today do not react as God did. Good parents don't get angry or withhold food or reject their misbehaving children. Good parents would continue to provide protection for their children rather than deliberately removing protection or somehow putting those children in danger. So, to be honest, the description of God's behavior in this psalm, let alone the behavior of God's children, is pretty shocking. In his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins, an English ethologist, evolutionary biologist, Oxford professor, and one of the so-called new atheists, probably somebody who would rather not be quoted in a sermon, frankly, wrote these words: "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." He doesn't have a very high opinion of God, at least the one in the Old Testament. And one can understand why. When you read Psalm 78, it does not disabuse you of this conclusion. God appears here manic and positively abusive. And this view of God is not an uncommon one in the evolving understanding of the nature of God in those ancient days. Now, to be clear, we don't understand God in the same way today. 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, when crops failed, children died, pestilence ravaged the land, or locusts devoured the crops, the people of God suddenly became conscious of their wickedness and immediately attributed their misfortunes to a Yahweh who frankly was irritated with them. And then some suggest we can soft pedal this image of an angry God because of the curious expression in verse 2, in which the writer suggests that what follows is a parable. Then, too, some scholars argue the Bible gives us a progressive revelation of the nature of God, that in Jesus we see God incarnate, that in Jesus we see the true image and the true nature of God. Well, it's all well and good. What we want to consider here, however, is whether God still, in the 21st century, puts us in timeout when we need discipline, or does something else. Now, I have to suggest to you that's probably a question to be answered another day, because I'm past my time. But I'll leave you with two things. A challenge, really, in these times. The first is to give thanks. I call it the Give Thanks Challenge. Express gratitude for the blessings in our life. Give thanks to God for the good things that come our way. Things that God probably had nothing to do with at all, but you can give thanks to God anyway. God perhaps did not give you a promotion at work, but you can thank God that you have work. God didn't give your baseball team the victory yesterday, but you could thank God anyway if your team won. God didn't cause your crops to grow this year or give you lots of tomatoes, but you can thank God that you have a garden and the opportunity to grow them. God doesn't give us A's on our exams, but we can thank God that we have teachers and the ability to learn and study and do well on our exams. God didn't give us a parking space at the restaurant's front door after dinner, but we can thank God anyway that someday in the future we can go to restaurants again and actually enjoy eating inside. In fact, the Bible says we should give thanks to God in all things. Sometimes it's hard. For instance, God didn't cause the roof to leak in my house, but I can give thanks to God that I have a roof over my house. God didn't give cancer to my mother-in-law when she developed a brain tumor and died, but I can give thanks to God that we had good nurses and skillful doctors to help us during that time, and a pastor who would pray with us, and other folks that prayed for us from our church. God didn't cancel family camp at Camp Mac this year, but we can give thanks we have a camp, and we can give thanks that sometime in the future we'll have family camp again. God didn't cause so-and-so to say bad things about you, but be grateful that you do have some friends that say nice things about you. And finally, God didn't send the coronavirus to make our life miserable. Be grateful for masks, for essential workers, for family and friends. Be grateful for your church family, because this is one of the best ways to parent the church, is just by giving thanks for each other. Second challenge, I call it the Live Right Challenge. The psalmist challenges us to live in such a way that time out isn't necessary. In fact, you might say instead of being time out Christians, we should be time in Christians. We should spend our time in serving others. This is one of the things I observe about Creekside, that you do a wonderful job of that, and I encourage you to keep doing that. We could spend time in study and prayer, time spent in offering our skills and talents to others, time in witnessing to the love of Christ, time in obedience to the Word of God, time in fellowship with other believers, time in bearing the burdens of others. Because when we're ready to accept these two challenges, we won't need to worry about being put in time out. Let's not give God a headache. Let's embrace the give thanks challenge and the live right challenge. This is what's pleasing to God, and I believe if the church embraces these two challenges, we will be parenting the church in the direction that it needs to go. Most of our conflicts will take care of themselves if we're giving thanks for the church and living rightly. I pray you will join me in giving thanks and living rightly. Amen.